Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club. Our sessions take place on the first Tuesday of every month and cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome lead dev audience can draw insights and practical experience from. Excuse me, little hairball. I'm Suzan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Suzan Bond. Today, we'll be talking about The Manager's Path, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. It's just such a perennial classic in our world. Fantastic book. If you have any questions for Camille, please pop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll be sure to take them. So Camille is an engineering executive and the author of The Manager's Path, as well as the editor of the new book, 97 Things Everyone Should Know About Engineering Management. She's a member of the engineering leadership team at Two Sigma Investments and is the former CTO of Rent the Runway. Rent the Runway, God, that sounded really funny the way I said that. She resides in New York City with her husband and 2 children. Welcome, Camille. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's so great. Okay, I've got errant hair here. So I always find the background of how books happen like super fascinating. And I think other people like it too. So how did The Manager's Path come about?
So I think a few things, right? I had been blogging on and off, for the years before I wrote The Manager's Path. I had a little bit of management experience before I joined Rent the Runway, but I really, really like had this kind of very rapid growth management opportunity at Rent the Runway, where I, grew to be the CTO there, built out this team, quite a bit. So, had to learn all of the stages of management. That was just such a massive learning experience for me. So I had been blogging a lot about the learnings that I had there. I had been part of surviving that experience meant meeting a lot of peers who were also managers, either with more experience or who were sort of going through similar kind of stages and learning from them. So really developing out a great network of fellow managers and leaders in tech. And when I left Rent the Runway, I actually sort of consciously left that company without a job lined up. I was like, all right, I don't know what I want to do next. I've done like amazing things here at Rent the Runway. It was a really like awesome career experience. I want to kind of take some time to figure out, should I start my own company? Like what feels right for me? So, I kind of left Rent the Runway without a job lined up. And a lot of people had said to me, oh, you should write a book about engineering management. And so because I didn't have anything lined up and I was just sort of decompressing and giving talks and, kind of like feeling out what I wanted to do next, I did NaNoWriMo, which is actually happening right now. So that's like a thing that lots of people do. It's National Novel Writing Month. And, the goal is to write, I forget what it is, 60,000 words or something in the month of November. So you write every day in the month of November. And so I think I left my job in late August or early September. I can't quite remember. And maybe late September. And then, so the month of November that year, I was like, all right, I'll just let's see if I have anything in me. And it turned out that I did. I actually produced a very, very rough draft, but I did produce a draft of what would later become The Manager's Path. So I wrote that up and I was like, I think there's something here. And I, sent it to an editor that I knew at O'Reilly, and they agreed. And, I think that when I wrote it, I didn't feel like there was really a lot of very like clear content for engineering managers about the different stages of engineering management. So there were there were definitely, this is not the only book on engineering management that had been written even at that time. And there's some other good books out there, but I think a lot of people wanted that a little bit of clarity about like the different roles. It is a very different job being a CTO or manager of managers than it is being a tech lead, right? And so kind of seeing how that progression happens, which I actually think, I do think that this progression is not totally different, whether it's a small company or a large company. There are, certainly nuanced differences, but I think that a lot of people have really gotten a lot out of, oh yes, like these are just some of the basic skills at each new level that you kind of have to accrue. And whatever size of company you're working at, like, look, if you can't figure out how to run a project, it's going to be very hard to become, a successful, manager. If you can't figure out how to do good one-on-ones, right? Like, these are just like basic skills, whatever size of company you work at, you need to know. And so I do think that people were really hungry for that structure and basics. And that's, that was something I thought a lot about. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I agree too. I feel like if we think about like career maps or career pathing, we have a lot in like up until like the management, and then the early stages of management, we have some of that. But then as you get further along, we don't really know what does it mean to be and how is it different than the other stages. And I think it gets fuzzier. So a book like this, it did strike me when I read it. I thought, oh, this is perfect for that. It really gives people a chance to understand and think about, well, is this right for me? And who do I need to be in this role?
Yeah.
In order to do well in it.
Exactly.
Like, what do I need to be thinking about? Which I think is fantastic because, that old saying, it's like what came before is not what comes afterwards.
Yep.
Right. They say it a lot, but it's true. So I'd love to talk about like thinking about that tech lead role. So, let's talk about like when people transition into the tech lead role, what's one thing you might say for them to think about?
Yeah. So I think, part of the job of tech lead really is that you have to be communicating with a lot of people a lot more than you may have had to do as just sort of a hands-on, engineer working on, a project, right? So, tech leads, there's a big technical component. You're probably still writing some code, hopefully still writing some code. But you have you have some project leadership responsibilities, you have some team leadership responsibilities. You can't just be thinking about your little part of the system or even really just the architecture or system design, right? The job, I think sometimes there's this misapprehension that the job of tech lead is like the person who reviews everyone's code and like tells them all like what to build. And like most of the time that's really not true. And I don't really think that's a particularly healthy way to do tech leads, right? Tech lead is a leadership, sort of coordination. Yes, there's technical leadership, but you are making sure the team that's working on whatever things you're tech leading, that they're working well. There's a little bit of that management component, right? You're making sure you're actually building the right things. So you're working with the product manager or the business leads or your peers and other parts of engineering to make sure you actually like understand the requirements of what everybody kind of needs to be doing. And you're anticipating where this is going to go wrong and how this project is going to succeed or fail. And so there's just a lot more time that you're going to spend communicating things and understanding the status of things versus, thinking about pure tech and writing code. And I do think that is sometimes, that can be a big change for people. But it is important, I think, to being a successful tech lead.
It's such a good point. Again, like talking about those transitions, I'm, like many of us come into leadership roles with expectations that don't necessarily always work out. Like I know it happened for me. Listen, when I came into being a COO, it was not exactly what I thought. I had expectations. They were not exactly the same. It was interesting. I learned a lot. And I love that you talk about this in your book. And I'd love to know, like how being more of like, for you being a senior IC was different than you imagined, or, like as you went through there, like, how was that for you? And being a manager, how are they different for you? What was your flavor of that?
Yeah, I think so. For me, being a senior IC definitely had its ups and downs. I really did. And I still, part of me, misses and, enjoyed really thinking very deeply about the tech, having lots of time to spend building and thinking about systems and designing systems and being, really hands-on and thoughtful about the software. And, I do think most senior ICs are in something of a leadership role. So even if you're not managing, you still are in that some kind of a tech lead role or whatever, where you do have, you do have responsibilities beyond writing code, but nobody's expecting you necessarily to like write reviews and do all of the like, frankly, more tedious parts of management. And so I really liked that aspect of being a senior IC. I do think that the career path for senior ICs is less clear than the career path for managers. And people, I have thought about this and worked on this and talked about this for a very long time. And people get a little bit, I think, they get sometimes ICs at this point, individual contributors. When I say IC, I mean individual contributors. Say, kind of get frustrated with me that like I can't just give them kind of the checklist for the next levels. And I think there is often a sense of frustration, like why is it clearer for managers about what they need to do to get promoted than it is for me as an IC? Like I want that clarity. I want that career path, fast career growth, and I do think that, I do think that it's genuinely like harder to be clear because the more senior ICs actually do tend to be a little bit snowflakish. They're each a little bit different. My observation is that I think great senior ICs always are bringing some set of skills that is beyond the technical. And that, that could be product skills or, mentoring and communication skills, right? Or, really large scale, kind of technical project management skills is what a lot of, great senior ICs, architectural skills. But, I do think that there are some things you can sort of point to and say, well, there's senior ICs that sort of look like this and look like that, but it is less clear. And there are fewer obvious opportunities on the job as a senior IC where you are genuinely like pushed into being forced to learn those skills, which is a big difference than management where for better or worse, like as a manager, if you can't communicate well, if you can't manage projects effectively, if you can't deal with conflict, if you can't make decisions or work with business partners or whatever, like at some point you will just not be successful in that job. Right. So anyway, I would say like for me being a senior IC, I really enjoyed a lot of the work. But when I switched into management, I really did it because I felt like I had kind of topped out in the skill learning that I was going to get, at least at the company that I was at, in the role that I was at as a senior IC, that I wanted to be kind of learning more new things faster. And I didn't want that more new things to just be like a new technology, right? I actually I wanted to kind of push myself in different ways. I wanted to push myself more in like some of the leadership and scaling ways. And so management was the right course of action for me at that point.
That's so great. That's really wonderful to sort of help people think about it. I think it's really true about senior ICs. That whole path is really, it's a harder path in some ways because there isn't a lot of defined things out there. Yeah, it's such a great point. So one of the things you recently wrote about was how new managers fail these individual contributors. And I think it's probably a pretty common problem. I mean, we can look on Twitter and probably see examples of this, people talking about this. So what do you think are some of the mistakes that they make and like how these managers might avoid that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that there are lots of common mistakes that new managers make for their ICs. I probably made some of these mistakes myself. I think that one of the, a lot of them kind of fall into the thinking that your job is just an IC who gets to tell people what to do. And I do think that is a very common new manager failure mode. I do think a lot of people go into management because they think that the job of management is telling people what to do, which is hilariously incorrect. In fact, as much as anything else, being a manager, you do not get to tell people what to do. You in fact are very much influencing, and you do have some authority, but the path you have to walk to exert that authority, it's just much better if people do things, because you have encouraged them and they want to do them and they see the reasons why. And it's much worse if you're saying like, no, you we're managing software engineers. These are highly talented, highly trained, highly valuable individuals. You don't, for better or worse, like this is just a different, knowledge worker management is a very different thing. But going back to the question, right? I think new managers often think that the job is I'm a technical person who tells people what to do, and I get to make the cool decisions, and I get to think about the tech, and I get to be super strategic and like get my ideas funded. And I become a manager to do that. And, that has just a lot of downsides, right? So, first of all, like it doesn't give the ICs the room to be creative themselves, to own decisions themselves, right? It probably means that you're neglecting thinking about their careers in favor, frankly, of thinking of your own. Right? You're thinking about how I want to do all the fun stuff, and these guys are just they're just worker bees for me, right? She's just got to implement that feature that I asked her for, and like I don't care that she doesn't like doing that, or that's not going to help her get promoted, right? I also think that new managers don't understand the technical path because they usually haven't climbed it very high. And they don't know who to reach out to ask for help, to create, mentorship opportunities for their up and coming, senior engineers. So there's a lot of things I think that new managers do, sometimes, I don't want to say maliciously, but I think sometimes a little bit intentionally, because they kind of want that glory and authority. They get a little bit too enamored with that. And sometimes unintentionally, right? Trying to be the person who, is like filling in the gaps for your team by writing a lot of code all the time. Sometimes new managers should be writing code. If you've got a small team, like I'm not, against that. But, if you're always filling in the gaps of writing code for your team, you're actually probably holding them back from being a better team and thinking about how you should be investing in hiring or processes or planning so that your team doesn't have to be doing that, right? If you're not teaching your team how to run projects themselves, if you're not training them in some of those more advanced skills that they will need to be successful individual contributors, again, like sometimes you think you're doing that to be nice. They don't want this. And that's, as a new manager, a lot of what you're learning is like how to kind of convince people that this thing that they may or may not want to do is actually a worthwhile thing to do, right? So anyway, those are some of the ways that I see, new managers hold senior individual contributors back from having a great career path.
Yeah, I mean, that's really great too. And it does think about the expectation. It goes back a little bit to the expectations, what they think the role is and what it actually is quite different. And I do think sometimes getting into the code, I see people, they're a little bit too into the code or a little bit too directing rather than influencing. And that's a really big difference, right? Because as an IC, maybe influencing is something you haven't had a lot of experience doing.
Very true. Yeah.
So you have to now I have to do something different, right? Mm-hmm. I always think like, I do this because, you do this because I'm your boss. I do this because you're my boss. It's just like, that's a tough place to really work from, it's where we go as humans.
Yep.
Yeah. It's such a great point. And you think, I know you talk about like having regular one-on-ones is like super important. That's something I think you care very much about. And you also think about like, well, what do you do during it, right? What's inside of that? And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your philosophy. And I think you have different styles of like, you think about one-on-ones in terms of like styles rather than just like, here's a template of how each one should go.
Yeah. I mean, look, I am a big choose your adventure, one-on-one style, meaning that I genuinely prefer for the people who work for me to kind of tell me what they want in sort of the structuring of their one-on-ones. I go back and forth as to whether this is a good idea or not. My tendency just as a leader is always like, I would really rather not force people to like fit into like a precise set of processes or, templates, because I do think that like people are different and, some people's brains work in a certain way and, they're going to be much more comfortable with a very free flowing, whatever kind of one-on-one. And other people really want to come in with like, a shared doc where they have every single thing that they want to talk about on a list and they're going to go down that list. So I've seen all of those because I have had people who work for me who have wanted to do all of those different styles. I have done variants of those myself with my own managers. So, I've worked for people who don't care. I've worked for people who, want some kind of outline of what I want to discuss. I think what I tend to find is that, so I'm like a discursive person. I'm going to talk for a long time. I like to kind of talk through ideas. And I like to talk through problems and, bring up stuff, that's on my mind at that moment. My boss is actually also this way, the person I work for now. So even having a template that you go into a conversation with a person like that, it can actually be, I think, probably frustrating if you want to get through everything on your list, if you are having a one-on-one with a boss that's like that, because you're going to talk. You're going to like have one of those. Now, and that's, that can be good and that can be bad, right? I think it can be frustrating, to have that expectation. So I try to not be too discursive with the people who report to me, who want to bring in kind of that template and list. I don't know, so I do think, I think one-on-ones are important. I think, 50% of the importance of one-on-ones is just the regularity of meeting and having time to discuss important things, even if you don't get through all the important things every week. It's a relationship building exercise first and foremost. You have that time reserved, because if you don't have that time reserved, then issues don't get raised and they fester and they turn into big, big, big problems.
I love that. I really agree with that. One, it's about relationship building, which I think sometimes we think it's just about a checklist or getting things done. But I think I 100% agree. It's about the relationship and also like the frequency. I mean, we've all been there when our lead keeps canceling on us, and then we're getting frustrated. I mean, come on, we've seen that all over Twitter, people complaining about that. Like, hey, don't cancel. I always tell my folks, do not cancel. If you don't have to, please try never to cancel those one-on-ones. There's like so much else that goes into canceling it.
Yeah.
It's like one of the most important meetings, right, that you can have.
It's one of the most important meetings. And, even moving it around during the week, which inevitably happens to more senior people who, don't have predictable calendars, I think can be very hard on their direct reports, depending on the direct report. I think I'm at the level where my boss moves, I want to run around. It's like, whatever, like, my job is to roll with stuff like that, but I try to not do that as much with the people who report to me. It certainly still happens. And, I think like the earlier you are in the management chain, the lower you are. If you're a line manager, you should really try to hold those one-on-one times sacrosanct and not move them very often. Occasionally, whatever, somebody's sick, somebody's out, something really urgent comes up. But, I think the predictability and the timing predictability is part of what makes them valuable.
I agree too. One last thing I'll say, I love this. I love that you're talking about this too, because I also hear people like, wait, they moved it to Friday. Am I getting bad news? What's happening? Why'd they move my one-on-one to Friday? It's always on Tuesday. It's like, don't put people through that mind trip, because that's where our minds go. You know what I mean? We're meaning making machines. Keep it simple, make it sacrosanct. I just love that. I mean, one of the things on this note that you talk about in the book too is like creating a culture of continuous feedback. I'd love it if you can tell us a little bit more about what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by that is that you shouldn't wait until formal feedback cycles to give people, kudos, as well as, hey, like this thing didn't go as well. And, here's what didn't go that well about it. Right. I think there is a lot of value in formal feedback cycles, because I think that taking the pause and the time to like really reflect on some period of time and look for patterns that you might not notice in the day to day, and actually, talk about those patterns and, laud those big accomplishments and whatever. I think that's very valuable. And, I actually do genuinely think like that is not a good idea to get rid of those pause opportunities for feedback. But I also think that like, if that's the only time you ever get feedback, that's not a great situation. And again, particularly people earlier in their careers are very sensitive to this and get very I've surveyed a lot of people on how they feel about their manager, and people earlier in their careers, but even people, more advanced in their careers they're thinking about promotion, they're thinking about what's next. And when their manager never takes the time to talk to them about, what they're thinking about, even when their manager is like thinking about that. Now, oftentimes the manager is in fact paying attention and saying, okay, like, I think this person should be promoted to the next level, maybe not this year, maybe next year. When you don't say those words to the person, they wonder, does my manager care at all about me? Or is it all just,
Right.
Whatever, the latest fire or the latest project or, but I also think that, like, especially when first of all, I actually do think that I've come around a lot. And praise, I think we don't give enough praise. We don't tell people good job enough. We don't call out something that went really well and say, hey, like, you should feel really good about this. That was a great presentation. That feature looks amazing. Like, you should be proud of yourself for handling this challenging situation. Like, so I do think that kind of feedback, every manager should be really thinking about, how often am I giving that? If I'm giving that, once in a blue moon, that's not good, right? It shouldn't wait till the reviews, and it shouldn't, it should come as often as you can, right? And making a habit of that is very good. A lot of people are conflict averse, and so they also don't want to give the negative feedback. And they sort of push that off. They don't want to have those tough conversations. Getting comfortable with giving the corrective feedback, or that could have gone better. How do we, what do you think about how that could have gone better? And getting better at having those conversations is a good practice for every manager. Particularly, there are certain things where, like, you need to address it very close to in the moment, right? This is especially true if, like, look, if somebody says something inappropriate in a meeting that makes other people feel uncomfortable, depending on the situation, you may or may not say anything right in that moment, but as a responsible party, you need to say something very, very, very soon thereafter, right? That should not wait till you're one-on-one even, right? There are times when you need to provide that very quickly. Sometimes it's okay to wait till the one-on-one, but getting in that habit of both, again, great things and not so great things, just, it takes the weight of it off people's shoulders. It makes it feel like less of a, oh my God, you moved my one-on-one to Friday, are you firing me kind of thing, right? It's like, oh my God, my boss is giving me, is saying I did something wrong. Oh no, am I getting fired? And it's like, no, if you're doing that, but also praising them regularly, they'll realize, like, no, hey, like, I just give a lot of feedback. Like, I give good feedback, I give bad feedback. I want to, like, make sure that, like, we're just comfortable hearing this on both sides.
Yeah, it sounds like you're constantly really underneath it all building trust and building the relationship in what the way you're talking, the way you think about both the formal feedback and the continuous and one-on-ones is like building the relationship and trust is what I hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's so good. I think we can get, like, down into, like, what do I do in the one-on-one? We can get into, like, the logistics and forget that it's about how we feel about each other. How are we working and interacting with each other?
Yeah. And, look, feedback is hard. And, I think one thing that people also forget sometimes is that I think there's two sides to it. One is that as a manager, look, again, the more experienced you are, the more confident you can be in this, but, like, it is your job to give feedback. And, it is your job to make certain decisions about whether somebody's performance is, middling, great, bad, whatever, right? You are kind of like, it is at some point you are an arbiter of, like, from my position as your manager in this company, knowing what I know, I think these things are great and these things are not good. Giving that not good feedback at every level, there you are going to have people who are not going to take it. And furthermore, that are going to argue with you. And if I can impart, like, one sort of advanced piece of advice to this audience, it is like, have the confidence that you are assuming you have done your best and you have really tried to, like, consider all sides and really be fair with this person. It is not their place to argue with you about the feedback. that they can take the feedback, they can ignore the feedback. You can't force them to take the feedback, right? That's the other thing. It's like the only thing you can do is, I guess, fire them or move them or whatever. But you cannot force someone to be a better communicator if you say your communication skills aren't that great and they say, what are you talking about? Like, my communication skills are great. Everybody else just isn't listening, right? Like, all right, well, you know what? Like, I'm not going to argue with you about this. I have said my piece. You can take it or leave it. Just know that if you leave it, it's going to hold you back. It's going to cause these problems. But I do think newer managers and even experienced managers, it's just really easy to get into these cycles of you're trying to give someone feedback and they're just fighting you on every single piece of it because it's very uncomfortable. I've done this. I've certainly wanted to argue with negative feedback. Like
100%.
You've ever written a book? Oh my God, let me tell you, your editor is going to beat you up and you're going to be like, my precious baby, I can't believe you don't understand what I'm saying in this section. It is so obvious. And you, editor, don't know what you're doing. And of course, that's completely untrue. Your editor is a brilliant person. And if they don't understand what you're saying, then what you're saying doesn't make any sense because they're not in your head, right? So nobody loves getting negative feedback, but, learning how to kind of take it and just, again, having also the self-confidence to say, you don't have to take that feedback, right? If you don't agree with it and you think your boss is wrong or you think the person giving you that feedback is wrong, then it's fine. You can reject it. Just know that there may be consequences to rejecting it depending on who it comes from.
I love that. Feedback is such a tricky one. It's human nature too, right? To get defensive, and it takes time. And I think some people too, it takes time. Like, I know my initial reaction is like, what? And then I'm like, wait, let me think about this a minute. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Maybe there's there's a kernel of truth. Some people are just like, they get very defended quite quickly.
Yeah.
And then managers have to realize sometimes they might take it later. They might take it, they might not, but it's human nature that people aren't going to go, oh, thank you so much. I mean, some people will, but that's not the majority in my experience.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Right? We'd love that. So I want to take we have some questions coming in from the audience, which I knew there would be. So I want to go to those questions. So how do you see the role of staff plus engineers in your organization, i.e. leadership instead of management?
Yeah. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, I do think that there are different, the staff plus engineers bring different skills to the table depending on their backgrounds and their strengths. So they're all very technical people, right? They all have, often multiple areas of technical depth that they have built up over their careers. But they tend to have sort of kind of add-on skills that may look different depending on what their background is. So, some of them, the leadership that they provide is they lead big technical initiatives, right? So they lead the big technical initiatives that cross organizations that are very, very technical. Cloud migration is a great example of this, right? A cloud migration has a lot of very technical aspects to it. And you want someone who is an engineer who can actually understand that, like, well, it doesn't matter if we move this stuff before we move this other stuff, it's not going to work because it's going to be crossing the WAN and it's going to have all these performance issues. And it's actually, it's going to be less reliable. There's going to be all these problems, right? So you want a very technical person who can look over the landscape of the technology and actually understand how this stuff should be broken down and, evolved, and, where we might want to say, let's not try to migrate this in that way. Let's just let's rewrite it. And before we move it, right. Versus like, we can lift and shift it. That's fine. So that's kind of like one set of things that I look to very senior staff plus engineers to do, is really like run those big cross-organizational technical initiatives. Managers can't do that, because managers are always going to be focused on whatever their sphere of control is. It's really, really hard as a manager to operate on any kind of like project or technical initiative outside of your sphere of management control. That is actually like a very important thing to kind of internalize, whereas ICs can operate outside of that, right? And some companies have project managers or product managers who do this. And I think that, like, it's very rare to find project managers who are really technical enough to run it well. It's not impossible, but it's a little bit challenging. On the other side, right, sometimes product managers are the right people to run things, but again, that's probably going to be more of a business thing initiative than a technical initiative. So there's that angle. Then there are those who are able to look at existing sets of systems and understand kind of a technical strategy. We want to move more to services, for example. We want to move to a services-based architecture. We've got kind of this various like crunchy monoliths and legacy and whatever running around. And they are able to kind of look at that and say, well, we need to solve for this particular very hard problem that is making it really hard for people to migrate their stuff into services, right? We need to, and there's lots of different things that could look like, but that they have the ability to look at something that is a system of technologies that is either missing something or needs to evolve in a certain way. And they can actually kind of write you almost a strategic technical roadmap for that may very well mean like building one or two things that they would actually be very involved in the building of, right? So it's a little bit less of that, like a big, we've got lots and lots of moving parts and we need to, do this very technical migration or uplift or whatever, and much more of a targeted product focused, like, if we had a product that did X, all of a sudden that would make this evolution, really unlocked, right? And then I think there's the example of like the engineer who like sees like the brand new thing that we should build, the way we should, if we just had this, TensorFlow machine learning plus blah, 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 then we can do this big thing. And I think a lot of people like, that's what they think staff plus engineers are. Yes, of course, there are also some of those, but that's actually not nearly that's definitely not like the majority in many companies of, in fact, what you want when you want IC leadership. I think in IC leadership actually looks a lot more like, I've got these big existing things and I need to move them forward. And moving them forward requires understanding lots of moving parts, requires seeing the missing piece that moves them forward. It's not necessarily just the greenfield build that I think a lot of people kind of, it's not just engineers, right? A lot of managers and business leaders who don't really understand modern software engineering and systems also think that it's like, well, it's the innovator. And it's like, yes, of course. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's other things.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try to get through a few more before we have to go here. It's so good. That was such a great, thorough answer. Okay. Another question from the audience. How do you think the manager's role and path is different during COVID time where things are more likely to be remote?
I mean, so I did not manage remote at all really before COVID. And I always am hesitant to speak too much about remote management because I do think like it has been very different in COVID than, I know a lot of people who were remote managers before COVID and their experiences are very different. I think that the emotional work that managers have had to do during COVID has been quite substantial. And I would say it is much more substantial than it's just a lot easier to keep a culture going when you see each other, even remote companies, right? They regularly come together and meet up and like form those human connections because it is really hard to make fully fleshed out a human connection with someone that you never see in person, right? You miss a lot. So I do think that the manager's role, I mean, I would say that like, look, a lot of what managers are doing right now is like trying to like, identify people at risk of burnout and say, hey, like, can I, proactively like change your workload? Look for new opportunities for you. Can we proactively like, just like downshift the amount of work we're trying to get done because people are burning out and like this team is like exhausted, how are we like making sure people know what's going on and communicating everything effectively? So it really has been, I think a lot of the things that are much easier to do when you have more in-person interactions, just take a lot more time remote and they do make the job. I mean, it's not nearly as much fun for me, at least. I think for a lot of managers who are a lot of
Yep.
the joy of the job is about like, building things and feeling like you're a team that's like pushing forward on a mission. And when your job is much more like just trying to keep it kind of afloat and keep people feeling okay about things, and you care about people and they're having tough experiences, like it's a much more challenging management role.
Oh, I 100% agree. Okay, another question from the audience. I often hear protect the team as a responsibility of managers. And in parentheses, I hear this from my own direct reports, in fact, parentheses, but it's also the EM's job to make sure the team delivers for the company. How do you manage the tension between loyalty to the team and loyalty to the company?
So I mean, there's like a master's thesis in that, right? I do think it's
There is.
I do think it's very challenging. So sometimes, so it's got to be a balance, right? Somebody I used to work with loved to talk about this idea that he had that was called renting focus, where he said, look, like, there's all this work, and this is, in the kind of platform infrastructure management space, which is where I'm in these days. So, big distributed systems, not necessarily building, consumer focused products. There's always stuff that the product manager, the whatever, somebody, that is sort of coming in as requirements, right? And there's always stuff that's like kind of boring, but needs to be done. We need to upgrade the system. Somebody's got to go on call. We've got to do this tech network, whatever, right? Some people like that stuff, but a lot of people, that's kind of like tedious. And so, and I think this is a wise philosophy, but what he would say is like, look, like, sometimes you're going to prioritize projects and work that the team really wants to do. And sure, it has value. You should be explaining them, should be thinking about how and where the value is come, but maybe it's not the most 100% pressing thing that some partner is asking you for, because you have to balance they're working on stuff that they actually find, intrinsically motivating and interesting, versus stuff that's coming in that just has to be done. As renting focus is you kind of like are bargaining with your team a little bit. You give them some work that they're going to love, and in exchange they understand that like this is a job and not every single thing I do is going to be the most fun work. Now, like that may be a cynical way to phrase it. Like I do think really good leaders are good at sort of, writing the mojo of all of this, sort of speaking to the value of everything, and, making it so that people really understand why what they're working on is important, even if it's not, at face value, something that they find exciting. But, the truth of the matter is that, like, let's be real, not everything is exciting. Not everything is exciting to everyone. There's always going to be times when people, want to do something different, and you're going to call up, you're going to ask them, to do something else. And you need to be able to like have at least something in your back pocket that you can actually let them do, and have you have the power and the ability to protect them so that they can go off and work on that thing. The worst is promising someone next quarter you can do that big rewrite and then never delivering on it. Like that will just burn your reputation with your team very quickly. I think the other thing that people tend to want when they say protecting the team is that the communication of work to the team sometimes also is just coming in from all sides, right? They're getting thrashed. They're having people come over and say, but I just need you to do this for me right now. And that is, that's really annoying. And I do think in that case, like you as the manager need to figure out, how do we triage requests that are coming in?
That's so good. Okay, we have so many questions. We're not going to be able to take anymore. These are so great. We have probably 5 or 10 more questions. Camille, those were so fantastic. So, everyone, if you want to put your questions in Slack, Camille can come back to them later and answer them. Camille does have something right after, so don't expect answers right away. But if Camille wouldn't mind, she'll try to answer some of these later. There's so many great questions in here. So thank you, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us, Camille. That was so, I feel like I've learned a ton right now myself. It was so great to have you here today. Thank you, everybody, for, yeah, it was so great. It was You should see the questions are fantastic. So we'll try to get those answered. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Our next session will be on December 7th, where we'll be speaking with Titus Winters on his book, Software Engineering at Google, Lessons Learned from Programming Over Time. And on January 11th, we'll be talking with Emily Friedman on her book, DevOps for Dummies. All right, thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.